It started with a simple desire to see my son smile again. After the divorce and the move to a cramped apartment in São Paulo, 7-year-old Leo had become a shadow of his former self. He was quiet, withdrawn, and the vibrant light in his eyes had dimmed to a flicker. I'm a freelance graphic designer, which means I spend most of my days chained to a glowing screen, and I felt a gnawing guilt that I wasn't doing enough for him. My world had become a routine of deadlines, reheated meals, and the suffocating silence of our new life. I believed I had control. I believed that with enough time, enough love, I could fix anything. I was a fool. One Saturday, trying to escape the apartment's oppressive quiet, we wandered through the flea market in the Bixiga neighborhood. It was a chaotic symphony of life, the smell of roasting corn, the sound of vendors hawking their wares, the press of the crowd. And there, in a dusty little antique shop tucked between a pizzeria and a closed theater, I saw it. The doll. It was a vintage porcelain thing, maybe from the 40s or 50s, dressed in a faded blue sailor suit. Its hair was painted on in perfect brown waves, but it was the face that caught my eye. It had a wide, painted-on smile, a cheerful, almost manic grin that felt out of place among the tarnished silver and forgotten portraits. "Look, Leo," I said, pointing. "What do you think of this little guy?" Leo, who hadn't shown interest in anything for weeks, looked up. His eyes widened. He walked slowly toward the doll, reaching out a hesitant hand. "His name is Pipo," he whispered, as if the doll had told him so itself. The shop owner, a stooped old man with eyes that had seen too much, watched us. When I asked for the price, he named a ridiculously low figure. "Just take him," he said, his voice raspy. "He's been on that shelf for too long. Needs a new home." There was an odd relief in his tone, a detail my rational mind filed away and promptly ignored. I was just happy to see a spark of excitement in my son. I paid the man, and he practically shoved the doll wrapped in old newspaper into my hands, avoiding touching the porcelain itself. That night, Leo placed Pipo on his bedside table. He fell asleep faster than he had in months, clutching the worn fabric of the doll's suit. I felt a surge of paternal pride. I had done something right. I was fixing things. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It was faint, a tinny, plinking melody, like a cheap music box, a lullaby. I got up and crept to Leo's room. The door was ajar, and I saw him sleeping peacefully, the moonlight casting long shadows across his room. The music had stopped. Must be one of his other toys, I thought, a battery dying or something. I went back to bed, dismissing it as a quirk of an old building filled with tired electronics. The next night it happened again. The same melody, but clearer this time. It wasn't plinking. It was humming. A high, soft, childlike hum. I froze in my hallway, the blood turning to ice in my veins. The sound was coming directly from Leo's room. I pushed the door open. Leo was asleep. Pipo sat on the nightstand, its painted smile seeming to glisten in the dark. The humming stopped the instant the light from the hall spilled onto it. I picked the doll up, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was cold, heavy porcelain. I turned it over and over. There was no seam for a battery compartment, no wind-up key, no button. Nothing. It was just a solid piece of ceramic and cloth. "It's the wind," I told myself, my voice a stranger's whisper in the dark. "The pipes in this old building. I'm just tired." I put the doll back, my hand shaking slightly. I told myself I was in control. That reality was a solid, dependable thing. But as I backed out of the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that Pipo's glassy eyes were following me. The humming became a nightly ritual. It never varied in its tune. A simple, haunting melody that wormed its way into my brain. I started leaving Leo's door open so I could hear it more clearly, trying to find a rational source. But it was always the same. A child's hum, soft and clear, starting around 3 a.m. and fading if I made any sudden moves. Leo seemed oblivious, sleeping through it every night. But he was changing. He was talking to Pipo constantly, animated one-sided conversations filled with whispers and giggles. At first, I thought it was cute, a lonely boy finding a friend. Then the strange comments began. "Daddy, Pipo doesn't like the light. "Can we close the curtains?" he asked one afternoon, squinting at the bright sun streaming through the window. Another day, at dinner, he pushed his broccoli around his plate. "Pipo says he's hungry, but not for this." A cold dread began to coil in my stomach. "What does Pipo want to eat, buddy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Leo looked at the empty chair beside him, then back at me. "He just says he's hungry, all the time." That was the turning point. This wasn't a game anymore. The next morning, while Leo was in the shower, I grabbed the doll. "We're going to put Pipo away for a little while," I said, trying to sound cheerful. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Leo let out a scream of pure anguish, a sound I had never heard from him before. He threw himself at me, sobbing, clawing at my hands to get the doll back. His tantrum was so violent, so primal, that it scared me more than the humming. Shaken, I gave it back. He clutched it to his chest, his sobs subsiding into hiccuping whispers into the doll's painted ear. I had lost control. My nights became a blur of sleepless anxiety and frantic internet searches. Vintage porcelain doll sailor suit, haunted dolls Brazil, singing doll no music box. Nothing. It was as if Pipo didn't exist outside our apartment. The humming grew bolder, sometimes starting earlier, a prelude to the darkness. I started noticing things. Pipo's head would be tilted at a slightly different angle than how Leo left it. Once, I found it on the floor by the door, as if it had tried to walk out. I was living in a state of low-grade, constant fear, the world I knew slowly eroding around the edges. I had to know where it came from. My only lead was the antique shop. I took a day off work and went back to Bixiga. A "for rent" sign was plastered on the glass. The shop was empty, echoing with the ghosts of forgotten things. My heart sank. A dead end. But I was desperate. I asked the owner of the neighboring pizzeria if he knew where the old man had gone. "Ah, so Alves," the man said, wiping his hands on a flour-dusted apron. "He retired, poor man. He shut the shop down right after you bought that doll. Said he had to get away. Moved into a home in Pinheiros." He gave me the name of the retirement home. The place was clean, sterile, and smelled of antiseptic and despair. I found Mr. Alves sitting in a communal garden, staring blankly at a wilting fern. He looked 100 years old. When I approached and mentioned the doll, the color drained from his face. His hands, resting on his lap, began to tremble. "You have to get rid of it," he rasped, his eyes wide with a fear I was beginning to know intimately. "You have to." "I can't," I pleaded. "My son, he won't let it go, and it hums. It sings a song every night." A dry sob escaped his lips. He fumbled in the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a small, worn leather-bound book. A diary. "This was my sister's," he said, pressing it into my hand. "She owned the doll before me. It was in her son's room when he passed. Read it. You need to understand what you've brought into your house." I spent the rest of the day in a nearby coffee shop, the world outside fading as I deciphered the elegant but frantic script inside the diary. It belonged to a woman named Lydia, dated from 1948. She wrote of her son, a boy named Pedro, who fell ill with diphtheria. She described his fever, his struggle to breathe, and the lullaby she sang to him night after night as he faded away. The lullaby she'd written down matched the tune that haunted my apartment. Pedro died in his room, clutching his favorite doll, a porcelain boy in a sailor suit he called Pipo, but the story didn't end there. Racked with grief, Lydia, according to local gossip she recorded in the diary, turned to something dark. A local woman, a mãe de santo known for practicing the darker arts of Quimbanda, offered her a way to keep her son with her, a ritual to bind his spirit to the object he loved most. The diary entries became more erratic. She wrote of hearing Pedro's whispers from the doll, feeling a cold presence in the room, but the comfort she sought soured into terror. The spirit wasn't her sweet Pedro anymore. It was something cold, hungry, and resentful of the living. It had become a parasite. The final pages were nearly illegible, stained with what looked like tears. Lydia had a second child years later. She'd packed the doll away, but her new son found it. The humming started. The boy grew weak, pale, wasting away from a mysterious anemia that baffled doctors. The last entry was a single, terrifying sentence. "He is not singing to him, he is feeding on him." The coffee in my cup had gone cold. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the diary. It wasn't a haunting. It was a curse. An entity latched onto an object, a predatory spirit that drained the life force of children to sustain its own twilight existence. Pipo wasn't just singing to Leo. It was consuming him. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. There was no rational explanation, no faulty wiring, no tired mind playing tricks. This was real, and my son was its victim. There was no escape. I tried to call my ex-wife, to tell her, to beg for help. Her voice was cold, clinical. "Arthur, you're not well. You're under a lot of stress. Don't you dare involve Leo in your delusions. If you keep this up, I'll call my lawyer." The line went dead, and with it, my last connection to a world that made sense. I was utterly and completely alone. My desperate attempts to fight back were pathetic. First, I tried reason. I sat Leo down and tried to explain that Pipo had to go. He just hugged the doll tighter, a strange, knowing look in his eyes, as if he were protecting a precious secret. He was no longer my son, not entirely. He was a vessel, a host. Then, I turned to force. One night, after Leo was asleep, I snatched the doll from his bedside table. Its porcelain face felt colder than ice. I tiptoed out of the apartment and down to the building's grimy basement, to the incinerator chute used for trash. My heart pounded with a mixture of terror and resolve. I opened the heavy iron door, the smell of burnt refuse assaulting me, and I threw Pipo into the darkness. I listened for the sound of it hitting the bottom, but I heard nothing. I ran back upstairs, my breath catching in my throat, and locked myself in my room, convinced I had won. The silence was profound. For the first time in weeks, there was no humming. The next morning, I woke up with a sliver of hope. I went to check on Leo. The first thing I saw was the doll. It was sitting on his pillow, not a scratch or a speck of soot on its blue sailor suit. Its painted smile seemed to mock me. Leo was sleeping beside it, his breathing shallow, his skin unnervingly pale. The dark circles under his eyes were now deep, purple bruises. The entity was no longer subtle. The humming wasn't confined to the night anymore. It would start at random times during the day, a constant, maddening soundtrack to our lives. Objects in Leo's room began to move. I watched, frozen in the doorway, as his toy cars rolled across the floor on their own. A stack of his favorite books flew off the shelf, one by one, hitting the opposite wall with violent thuds. Leo didn't even flinch. He just sat on his bed, whispering to Pipo. My friend Ricardo, my staunchest ally in skepticism, came over, worried by my frantic, incoherent phone calls. "Dude, you look like hell," he said, his face etched with concern. He tried to rationalize everything. The doll was a coincidence. Leo had a bad flu, maybe mono. He needed to see a doctor. As he was speaking, the door to Leo's room, which had been wide open, slammed shut with a deafening bang that shook the apartment. We both jumped. Ricardo stared at the door, his face pale. He made an excuse about a meeting and left quickly. He stopped answering my calls after that. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on me, crushing my sanity. I stopped sleeping, subsisting on caffeine and fear. I would sit in the hallway all night, a useless sentinel, watching Leo's door. But the horror was no longer contained to his room. One night, I barricaded his door with a chair and sat on the floor, my back against the wall, ready for the humming to start. Instead, it began behind me, inside my own head, a soft, clear humming, as if a child were standing right next to my ear. I scrambled away, my heart seizing in my chest, and saw a flicker of movement down the hall, the shadow of a small boy darting into the darkness of the living room. I was losing my mind. The line between the real and the nightmare had dissolved completely. My apartment wasn't a home. It was a cage I shared with a predator. I understood the horrifying truth Lydia had discovered too late. The spirit wasn't just in the doll. The doll was an anchor, a focal point. The entity had already latched onto Leo. Getting rid of the object was useless. The parasite had already found its host. My attempts to fight it had only made it stronger, more aggressive, as if it were punishing me for my defiance. I was no longer a father trying to protect his son. I was a man trapped in a ghost story, and the ending was being written in my child's fading life force. There was only one place left to look for an answer: the diary. I read it again and again, my sleep-deprived eyes scanning the frantic script for anything I might have missed, and I found it. In one of the last desperate entries, Lydia mentioned something the Mãe de Santo had told her, a fragment of a conversation about the ritual. The spirit, she'd been warned, would always be hungry. It would always yearn for the life it lost. But it could be placated. It could accept a trade, an offering, a substitution, a soul for a soul. The words chilled me to the bone, but they also ignited a single terrible spark of hope in the darkness of my despair. I looked at my son, sleeping in his bed. He was so thin, so fragile. The life was draining out of him, drop by drop, and I was powerless to stop it. But maybe I wasn't. Maybe there was one last, desperate move I could make. A sacrifice. That night, I waited until the humming began, the familiar, dreadful melody filling the apartment. I walked into Leo's room. The moonlight fell across the bed, illuminating Pipo's face. Its smile was a grotesque gash in the darkness, its glass eyes glittering with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. I reached out and picked it up. The porcelain was so cold it felt like it was burning my skin. I held it in front of my face, my reflection distorted in its vacant eyes. "Is this what you want?" I whispered, my voice a broken thing. The air in the room grew heavy, frigid. "You want a life? You want a friend to sing to? You can't have him." My voice grew stronger, fueled by a father's final, desperate love. "Take me instead. His life is just beginning. Mine is yours. I'll stay with you. I'll listen to your song, forever. Just let him go." I pressed the doll against my chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a cold, unlike anything I have ever felt, flooded through me. It was not the cold of winter. It was the cold of the grave, a profound, soul-deep emptiness that extinguished every spark of warmth inside me. The humming stopped, not just in the room, but in my head. The silence was absolute, deafening. And in that silence, I felt something break within me. Something essential was scooped out, leaving a hollow void that would never be filled. Leo started getting better the very next day. The color returned to his face, his appetite came back, and the light, my God, the light, returned to his eyes. He woke up one morning and pushed the Pipo doll off his bed as if it were a stranger. He never spoke of it or played with it again. It now sits on the highest shelf in my closet, a silent porcelain effigy. It is inert, just a doll. The curse is no longer inside it. It's inside me. I survived, but I am not alive. I go through the motions of life. I work. I cook for Leo. I take him to the park. I can see his happiness, but I can't feel it. All my emotions have been muted, flattened, replaced by that constant, hollow cold. I am a ghost in my own life, a spectator watching my son grow up from behind a wall of impenetrable glass. I saved him. That is the one truth I hold on to. But the price was my soul, and though the world is silent now, I am never truly alone. Every night, when I close my eyes and surrender to the darkness, I hear it. Faint, distant, but always there, inside the quiet ruin of my mind. A tinny, sorrowful lullaby. The song of the boy who never grew up. My constant, eternal companion. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. I learned that the hard way. I live with the knowledge that the veil between our world and the next is thin and fragile, and that sometimes, when you stare into the abyss, it doesn't just stare back. It climbs inside you and makes itself at home,